5 Access and Innovation and Disability Symposium. We're so excited to have you here with us this morning. Funding for this symposium was made possible through CU Boulder's Impact Grant, the Office for Access and Community Engagement in the College of Arts and Sciences, CU Libraries, and Be Well. My name is Sonja, and I'm a member of the symposium's planning committee. For those of you that required a visual description, I have long curly brown hair, glasses, a kind of large silver necklace and a black shirt, and a background that has a QR code and a disability flag over some views of the mountains. And before we introduce today's presenters and panelists, I would like to remind everybody to mute themselves during the presentation and that closed captioning is available either on the bottom of your screen with a little square filled with the letter CC and labeled captions, or under More, which is a circle with 3 dots in it. And again, you will see that option that has that square with the CC and captions. So you're welcome to turn that on. These captions are auto-generated by Zoom, so they are not fully perfect, but they are about as good as we can get from auto-generated captions. So let us know if you're having trouble with that, and I'm happy to help. You can direct message me if that is your preference, or just put it in the overall chat, and I will try to help you out. Please do feel free to use the chat and reaction emojis throughout the presentation to interact with one another and with our wonderful presenter. And we'll be using the last 10 to 15 minutes of this hour together for questions, during which time you can feel free to raise your hand using that system at the bottom of your screen as well. It has a little hand like this, kind of like an upright hand with the 4 fingers and thumb pointing upwards, and a raise hand symbol or raise hand label. The reactions are right next to that. They should show up with a heart and the text react as well. You are also welcome to use the chat for those questions. I'm going to turn it over to our other moderator for this session, Casey Boyd, to introduce themselves and our wonderful presentation today.
Thank you, Sonja. I'm Casey. I'm also a member of the planning committee and a 4th-year chemistry PhD student. I have shortish blonde hair, blue shirt, hazel eyes, and a goatee. I will now introduce today's presentation, which is Neurodivergence and Burnout: How Can Institutions of Higher Learning Make a Difference, by Elizabeth Novosel. This session explores burnout in academia, focusing on how it affects neurodivergent students and employees who face additional challenges like systematic ableism and discrimination. Burnout, caused by chronic stress and worsened by factors such as marginalized identities and campus culture, can lead to exhaustion, detachment, and reduced motivation, impacting well-being and retention. While burnout is widely studied, its intersection with neurodiversity receives less attention. The presenter, who identifies as neurodivergent, will discuss common causes of burnout in academic settings and invite dialogue on how campuses can better support neurodivergent individuals by removing barriers to their success. Please note that this session will be recorded and later added to the ACE Office YouTube channel, which the link will be provided shortly. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you all to our presenter. Liz Novosel is an interdisciplinary librarian at CU Boulder who works with a variety of subject areas, including computer science, mathematics, applied mathematics, economics, and Germanic languages and literatures. She identifies as being neurodivergent and having medical disabilities. Inspired by disabled family members, students, friends, and colleagues, Liz focuses a great deal of her services and research work and disability issues in higher education and in academic libraries. With that, I will turn the presentation over to Liz.
Thanks, Casey. Okay, everybody, I'm going to share my screen. All right, that should work. All right, and then we'll see if we can get this into presentation mode here. Get this small. I don't know how people do this so well, but slideshow. Okay. No, dang. Do you all see my whole everything or just what you should?
Yeah, we see the presenter view.
Oh, poo. This happened yesterday for someone. Oh, dang. Anyone wants to give me some hints?
Yeah, I wish I could be of use, but I never use
Mm,
PowerPoint.
no,
So
I
if
think we
anyone
got
has any,
rid of
Liz,
presenter
if
view.
you stop sharing your screen and then
Yep.
if you go back through share screen,
Mhm.
I would put your presentation in, like start the slideshow, and then one of the options can be share just the slide screen.
Okay, because I don't need any view in particular. Sorry, everyone.
You're good, Liz.
All right, I'm gonna stop sharing.
don't worry about it.
Oh, stop share. There we go. All right.
Now, if you get your slideshow how you want it on your screen, and then you'll reshare and just share the
Shoot.
slideshows.
Okay. I should be able to do this, everyone.
Got it,
I
Liz.
use Google Slides. I don't use this very much, so here we go. I don't want presenter view. Dang. I swear, I just did it the other day with everybody. View. I don't know. Dang. This is not how this is supposed to go, everybody. I don't know how to stop doing this. There. Okay, maybe that. Oh my gosh. Okay. I will see if this works now.
Okay, someone else had a suggestion in the chat, start slideshow, and there's a button to swap displays that will switch which view is on which screen. So are you working with two screens?
No,
Oh,
but
okay.
I just had it look right. From the start. Okay, that'll work.
Got it.
All right. Woo! Wow. Good morning, everyone. And thanks so much for coming now that we're actually going to start talking. As Casey so kindly introduced me, my name is Liz Novosel, and I am a librarian here at CU Boulder. And today I will be talking a little bit about neurodivergence and burnout. Before I start, I want to do a really quick special thanks to a whole bunch of colleagues, because there's been a lot of work done in the libraries where we've informed ourselves about burnout in an attempt to kind of counteract some of the things we've been seeing post-COVID in our workplace. But Katerina Almendinger, Rocco Labriola, Emily Dommermuth, and Claire Hogue were particularly helpful. And for me, for all of us, all of your work has been so important. And as I say here, your care, energy, and hard work, along with that of many others, so there were other people involved, is reflected in a lot of this presentation today. So thanks, everybody. We're going to talk today about, oh, you know what? I didn't do a description myself. I'm a white woman wearing glasses with my hair up in a ponytail with a very unpopular side part these days. I'm wearing a denim overshirt and a shirt with a pride heart on it. So I have blue eyes. So, we're going to talk about what is burnout, what is neurodiversity, that intersection between the two, and what, from my perspective right now, and I'm going to invite everyone to have their own opinions and to share ideas and their experiences, but what we can do to support people who are neurodivergent in our settings, those students and workers. It's important to say too that originally this work was done, well, kind of piecemeal, that I've learned a lot about how librarians support or do not support, depending, students. And then this group in the library is really focused on workers. So this, I'm trying to bring them together because I think a lot of the concepts are very applicable to both groups. So just to be aware, if I sound like I'm talking about one or the other, I probably just got off on one for that slide. So as you know, I'm an interdisciplinary librarian. I identify as neurodivergent. I try to be very open about that. I have ADHD. I got this diagnosed after my children because I was reading the books and realized, interesting. I also have something called hyperacusis. I have like anxiety related hearing trouble, especially in loud spaces, and a bunch of medical stuff that I won't bore you with, but So that's my identity in terms of neurodivergence. I do a lot of research. I try to do research about disabilities in academic libraries. There's a lot more to be done. Really, the most important thing I can say here is that I am no expert. I read about a lot of this stuff. I care a lot. And I can only really speak from my experience and what I have been exposed to through the people in my life. So I don't speak for the neurodivergent community broadly. I'm sure most of you are aware of that, but I just like to state it because I would love to get feedback and hear people's perspectives. And so anyway, just be aware. So yeah, I try to be really open because I feel like it's one of the things I can do is to advocate. I've watched my kids learn to be self-advocates and feel like I can try to do some of that work too. And also just to be very honest about my positionality as well. A lot of things will probably escape my notice because I am white, educated, I'm cisgender, heteronormative, all those things, and I have good healthcare. And so there's things I don't get exposed to personally. I read about them, but I don't have as much experience there. So that limits me as well. Let's see. So it's a question of how to move things. Oh, go away, little thing. All right. So why is this topic important? Well, a bunch of you have joined me this morning, and I know from working, I'm part of the Alliance for Neurodiversity, and I saw some of our folks here today. It's called AND. It's a affinity group here on campus for neurodivergent people. And we've been doing a lot of trainings. So I'm part of that group, but approximately 20% of the population is neurodivergent. That figure goes up and down depending on where you find your information. We neurodivergent people, I should say, such a broad group, are a little more susceptible to burnout due to a lot of factors. Not a little, quite a bit, honestly. I have a list here on the slide, but ableist or discriminatory policies and practices and procedures, we can talk more about that, and people can share their experiences with that. Ableist microaggressions, which a lot of times are, as many microaggressions are purported to be, unintentional, but still harmful and can really derail someone's day and bring harm to them in the workplace or on campus. Inaccessible or intolerable physical spaces, and I will add virtual spaces as well, because sometimes they just don't work for people. There's inadequate accommodations and support. There are a lot of intersectional layers of discrimination. So folks who've got a lot of different minoritized aspects to their identity are going to be much more impacted than those with less. And a big one too is ableist attitudes in supervisors or management. Those can be very, very damaging. And actually, I think that's why I brought Ann up before. We've been hosting supervisor trainings about neurodiversity, and they've been really popular. So I know it's a popular topic on campus. So like I've already mentioned, in fall 2023, I worked with a bunch of my colleagues here in the libraries to learn about burnout. I brought the neurodiversity part to it for myself. It was something that wasn't addressed much in the literature that we were reading. Because we really tried to inform ourselves and understand, what is burnout and how is it different from just being tired or other things, depression, for example. And we really wanted to understand to help our working space in the libraries improve and to offer some legit suggestions to our leaders. But let's see, I said a bunch of this already. But yeah, I'll just reemphasize that there's just not that much written. Some things specific to the neurodivergent crowd about burnout, but in the greater burnout literature, you don't see a whole lot about neurodiversity or disability. I'm focusing on neurodiversity here, but disability could also be very much included in this conversation. So I wrote a chapter about that for a book that's coming out, and it really helped me explore not just the academic literature, but I also looked at a lot of blogs, podcasts, social media of people who identify as neurodivergent. And it was really interesting and really helpful to understand that intersection. Okay, so I just want to do a quick question, and I'm guessing, that people have had this, but who here, if you have experienced burnout, from your perspective right now, what you understand burnout to be, there's a more technical definition, I'll get into some of that in a minute, but if you could indicate in the chat or just put a hand up or something, if you feel like in the last year you felt like you were burned out. Oh yeah, I see some people commenting. Yep, some hands raised. I'm not looking at everybody, but I'm seeing the chat. So it's a very common experience for sure. Like this. Okay. Right. So let's talk about what burnout is. There are, like all things, some disagreement in the literature and from experts. But essentially it comes from unmanaged workplace, or in our case here today, academic stress. So the stressors are ongoing, unchanging. It's considered to not be a medical condition, but it clearly impacts physical and mental health. A lot of the literature says it is occupational in nature. And with students, I think we can say that being a student is one of their occupations. So it's applicable there as well. It is often complicated by other life areas. So other things going on in your life can really make that burnout worse, but it is, when they talk about it, focused on work or school. And it's a lot more likely when someone feels, so in here I say worker, but if you feel like you're not a very good match for what's being asked of you, you are at much higher risk for burnout. So whatever that looks like. So that match could be, your skills are not great for whatever it is, or you don't enjoy it, or it is beyond a skill level that you feel comfortable with, you need more training, etc. Okay, some of the common symptoms or characteristics. When you start reading burnout stuff, these are what you see over and over and over again. Exhaustion, so that can be mental or physical. Cynical detachment, that's a big one. So a loss of, as I say here, a social connectedness at work, or a loss of meaning of work. It also could just be feeling you are not aligned with the values of your workplace. And so you get cynical, like things aren't changing, etc. I can't make, I can't get a professor to work with me on something. So it's just this detachment. And all of that kind of results in a reduced sense of efficacy. So feelings of not being able to do the work, whatever it is, and that you can't meet expectations. And that can result in some low self-value. Here I say work, but in anything, or just a sense of hopelessness and pointlessness. So here are some of the contributing factors that are really commonly talked about. So an unsustainable workload. When it's just too much, if you have too much on your plate, you can't get it done. You don't have control over any of those things, like deadlines, the amount, how it's done. So no control. You don't get sufficient rewards for your effort. So even if you put in tremendous effort, you either don't get recognized at work, or you don't get good grades. You lack a supportive community. You feel like things aren't fair. Things are kind of stacked. Someone has preferential treatment. And that there is a mismatch in your values or your skills with what's being asked of you, like something you don't believe in, or you don't think is right, or you don't like, or you don't feel like you have the skills for it. So here are some things. Now this is organizational, but I think this could be applied to academics as well. But organizational characteristics that encourage burnout in workers. So any environment where there's a work overload. So your job demands are really high and seem to only increase, not decrease. There's not enough resources to do the job well. So that could be material resources, that could be coworkers to help you, or other students, or you don't have what you need to get the job done. For students, that could also be like you don't have the correct assistive technology, or things are really not working to access, in our case as a librarian, maybe articles or something like that. Or you feel that something is trivial, meaningless, or unrecognized, something that doesn't really matter, but you have to do it. So maybe a busy work sort of situation. Emotionally taxing work. So in the libraries, we have a lot of people on the front lines dealing with, patrons all day long. So students and faculty and staff. And sometimes that can be really difficult because people have lost things or they're emotional. We've had some swatting events recently, so that puts a huge emotional tax on everyone. So all of this combined with no recovery time. So there's always more piled on. There's never a downtime. You can't really take time off or not enough, or just have a time at work or in your studies to just kind of absorb. It's always like more and more and more. So also a lack of control is really a big feature of where people have burnout. So in a situation where there's micromanagement, or a perceived incompetent leader or professor, ineffective teams, you're forced to work with students that you don't think are doing their fair share or that you don't work well with, or in an employee situation, you don't have a team that's supporting you, etc. And if you have no autonomy over your work, you think it should be done this way, you're being told to do it that way, and there's just really not any way that you can inform that decision. This is kind of a theme that keeps coming up, but requirement to do undesirable work. So that could mean something that you're just not good at, you don't enjoy. Maybe that face-to-face work, maybe that I just mentioned before with our front desk folks. A lot of everybody here takes turns doing it, but maybe that is just something that's very stressful and that you don't enjoy, and that can lead to burnout. Little or no meaningful recognition. So that could be not good grades, that could be not being recognized as putting in the hard work that's necessary in your job, and a lack of control over your schedule or how things are done in terms of timing. Sometimes people really need some flexibility of finding a time that works for them. So the citation on this slide, Christina Maslach is one of the noted experts in the field. She was pretty pioneering with it, developed some of the inventories, the early inventory, especially for identifying burnout in the workplace setting. And there's tons and tons now of inventories that people can take to assess their level of burnout. But she's one of the early pioneers, and she kind of set a lot of this in motion and established some of these definitions or defining characteristics of burnout. I thought this was interesting. I took a little look recently because 2025 being what it is, being an exciting time, I did find some mostly industry reports about burnout, and that a quarter of American workers regularly experience burnout. That's pretty high. And then this industry report suggests that burnout has gotten worse in the past year. So it's progressively getting worse, which makes sense because we have a environment society-wide, especially I would say in higher education and in government, where things are unstable. You don't know what to expect. You may or may not have a job. You may or may not have a grant, et cetera, et cetera. There's just more and more piling on all the time. So that's like perfect burnout situation. Okay, what is neurodiversity? It is a big job to try to define neurodiversity in my mind, as it's very broad and affects people in a lot of different ways. So turn to the dictionary. I just wanted to see what they had. I thought it was helpful. So the first definition here, number one, individual differences in brain functioning regarded as normal variations, large words, within the human population. And then the second one is the concept that differences in brain functioning within the human population are normal, that brain functioning that is not neurotypical should not be stigmatized, and that people with neurodivergent brain functioning should not be excluded from groups, organizations, etc. So I thought that was helpful. I also liked these quotes. The term neurodiversity refers to the variability in the way people think, process information, and understand the world around them, from Bella Fazio. And then Nick Walker, who's a professor in California, says that some forms of innate or largely innate neurodivergence, like autism, are intrinsic and pervasive factors in an individual's psyche, personality, and fundamental way of relating to the world. And what I like about these quotes and the definition is talking about neurodiversity and as a variation in the way brains work, function, the way people think. That's normal. There's variation in all parts of us and the natural world. This is just one more. And I liked Nick Walker's definition because it talked a little bit about how it's fundamental to people's like personality, to their psyche, to their sense of self in many cases. Not for everyone, but and Nick Walker identifies as autistic, so I guess that fits because a lot of autistic people certainly cannot speak for all, but feel like it's a major part of who they are and their identity. Here are some examples of neurodivergent affiliated conditions. I'm not going to read the whole list. And these are just some. And also to say this is kind of a medicalized way to approach it. Like here are all the diagnoses that could be considered neurodivergent. But I do think it's helpful to see them and to know that there's a wide breadth of what is considered neurodivergent and who identifies that way. And so all of these things affect brain function and not necessarily for the bad. And that's one of the things that I find frustrating talking about neurodiversity in this sort of a format is that I find like, especially with burnout, I'm kind of coming at it a little bit from a deficit perspective of like the things that we don't have or the things that are bad, whereas there's a lot of asset to look at too in all of these things. As my kid, who's one of my big inspirations in my life, and anyone who knows me knows I talk about my kids a lot, but my one kid is pretty significantly neurodivergent and is so proud of the fact that he thinks differently and he sees things differently and understands in a different way than a lot of his peers. And I think there's a lot of room for that. So I just wanted to add that little thought in there. I was thinking about on my way in this morning. Just to reemphasize that 20% of us or more, I would argue, potentially more, is thought to be neurodivergent or identifies that way. So that's a lot. And that means that even if you do not identify as neurodivergent or you don't know anyone who does, you're working with them. We are all around you. So as I've been kind of saying, there's a lot of different understandings of neurodivergence. And so this quote was kind of captured that for me, that neurodiversity is not yet well captured, suffers from poor and conflicting definitions, confusing and overlapping symptomology, and little guidance on practical support at work or in the world. So I think that's very true. Okay, so the question that I've gotten and have struggled with a little bit is neurodivergence a disability? And it's complicated. Maybe not everyone's favorite answer, but it's also very personal. So some people feel that they have a disability. Our system encourages that because, for example, my kid has to identify as disabled to get the 504 that helps him have extra time for exams and take some of the pressure off, etc. So kind of a forced perspective or identity as disabled. But in his case, because I can only speak for me and mine, because everyone has a different take on this. Disability is not a bad word, and it is something that is so intrinsically a part of who he is. And I feel like it is for me as well. I'm a little bit less enlightened than him. I'm still learning from him and everyone around me. But some people do feel strongly that it is a disability. Others do not identify that way at all and find it distasteful or upsetting. So I would encourage everyone to think about that and to be careful with our words and to remind me as well, because sometimes people don't want to be referred to that way, understandably, because there's a lot of negative connotation. I'll talk about language a little more in a minute. So also, I just wanted to mention that I typically talk about invisible disabilities. There are lots of different words for that. Neurodivergence is generally considered an invisible or non-apparent disability because you can't look at someone and say, X is going on here. You can't see there is necessarily a difference. But sometimes you can. I mean, my people would say that they feel that they can, whatever, that's a different thing. I also tend to use identity first language, which some of our presenters this week have talked about. So I will say something like a neurodivergent person or a disabled person or an autistic person rather than a person with disabilities. Just it resonates better for me and my identity and for a lot of the people I work with who identify as either autistic or neurodivergent. So that's what I use. But we should respect, my last point on this slide is that we need to respect people's choices, and language choices are one of them, but also their privacy. And I try to be an advocate. Some people do not feel comfortable with their identity being known. So if you do know, it's revealed to you, or you find out in some way that someone is neurodivergent, just make sure that that is public knowledge before you mention that elsewhere. My very last statement on this is that ableism is real, and it does impact people and can have a really negative impact on their lives, their work, their studies, and bias. So just to be thoughtful on that. All right, let's talk about language a little bit more. So it's powerful stuff, right? And as I'm sure we're all kind of paying attention in the last year or so, the words that we use are very opinionated words. They're very strong. They have lots of connotations and meanings, and those meanings shift over time. So I guess really what I'm trying to say here is that people are going to have different words they want to use for their identity, for who they are, and those will change over time. And so our job is to listen to each other and to be careful and to pay attention to the words that are used out there in the world, and stay informed as much as you can, and to know what is a okay word, what is not, and just to ask when you don't know, to ask. It can really impact people. So I try to ask when I can, what the people's preferences are, if someone seems to not like a word I've used, etc. Conversation is our best way in communication. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but neurodiversity versus neurodivergent versus neurodiverse. Just kind of people use them interchangeably a lot, but neurodiversity is kind of the noun, this individual brain differences. Neurodivergent is the adjective to use about a person. Like I identify as a neurodivergent person, but people individually are not neurodiverse. So maybe this is just one of my own little, pet peeves, but a group can be neurodiverse, but an individual is not diverse, right? So anyway, just throwing that out there. So now I want to get to the real topic at hand. So neurodiversity and burnout. So factors contributing to burnout that are specific to neurodivergent people. So remember all the stuff I talked about at the beginning about burnout and, like different factors that can make people feel stress and ongoing trouble at work, and that it impacts them in negative ways. All of those things I already talked about. Those are there for neurodivergent people already, right? They've got that like everybody else. But on top of that, they're dealing with discrimination and bias, communication struggles, not for everybody, but different kinds of communication struggles for different people. A concept called masking. So a lot of people who are neurodivergent, because of this whole ableist bias and discrimination, may be trying to mask as much as possible. As an invisible or non-apparent disability, a lot of times neurodivergent people have the choice to try to appear non-disabled, non-neurodivergent, and pass as what we would all, no, not all, but like people call it neurotypical, just to avoid the stigma, to avoid the questions, etc., to just appear like anybody else, try to avoid that bias. Other things that could be really impactful are uncomfortable or intolerable work conditions. So that can be lots of things. That can be a physical environment. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. That like specific things that are not, they prevent someone from being able to do their work or study or learn. And maybe most broad, kind of vague, but important are inflexible and ableist policies, procedures, rules, timing. Like anytime it's, this is the way it's done, we can't alter it for you kind of thing can be a big problem for neurodivergent people. And I'll share some examples, but everyone else can at the end too. So in all of these spaces, in learning spaces, in workspaces, there are interpersonal, I'm going to talk about kind of two, like the, we'll start with interpersonal bias and discrimination. Like then there's a more procedural thing I'll talk about next. But so as I already mentioned, language is really important. The microaggressions and inspiration porn, if you've not heard that term before, I'll explain what that is. But language I talked about, microaggressions are many. Like any sort of disabled person or any sort of marginalized identity, any sort of comments about, you look normal, don't be so sensitive, you're so brave. That's actually more kind of inspirational porn kind of thing. But like anything where you imply, wow, you do so great for X or something like that is a microaggression. Offering of help, being impressed by somebody for something they did that's not all that impressive, anything like that. There's a whole range of like from really aggressive and like kind of threatening all the way to like, oh, you sweet thing, you know, like kind of more subtle. And people often don't recognize that side of the spectrum. So inspiration porn is kind of it's often used more about disability broadly than about neurodiversity, but I thought it was worth bringing up of like, you know, you see a poster of someone with, you know, some sort of physical disability impairment. They're in a wheelchair, they've got a prosthetic, something like that, running a race. So it's like, if they can do it, you can do it too, kind of thing, like using the achievements or the just life of someone with a difference to be inspirational to those without. That's inspiration porn and yuck. So just to be aware of what that is. Jokes, there's a lot of jokes. Unfortunately, I have teenagers and I have, luckily not from their friends, but I have heard some pretty awful things said around the school that about neurodivergence. So just don't joke. And if someone is making jokes, either in an educational or work setting, stop it. You know, think about your bystander training if you've had it. And if you haven't, you should get it because, you know, like, stop it. Personal questions. So these next two, the stereotypes and personal questions, I just made up some kind of silly, you know, questions or statements. But anytime you know about someone with a difference, asking them about their personal stuff, that's pretty not cool generally. But sometimes with disabilities and neurodivergence can kind of fall under that. People feel somehow entitled to ask personal questions. So I just put on here, I thought autistic people didn't make eye contact, but you know, asking, trying to get more information from someone is, it's just not appropriate. But I will say there is room for conversation. If you have a close relationship with someone, that's a different situation. Or if you feel like you made someone uncomfortable, it's not that you can't discuss things, but let's bring out some, you know, some tact and being delicate about it if you need to. And if someone's like, I don't want to talk about that, to respect. There are a lot of stereotypes out there. A lot of times they revolve around autism, but there's lots of other ones. So I just threw, you know, wow, you can count cards like in that movie Rain Man. I would hope no one would ask that, but just to be aware of stereotypes and to know that there is a really broad spectrum of experience for any neurodivergent condition or way of thinking. So yeah, just they're out there and just to be aware. Okay, so structurally, ableist hiring practices and admission practices for students. There's just a lot of stuff that people don't think about that can be really hard for a lot of different people. I listed some of them here, but anything from the work side where it's like you're interviewing and it's, you know, no breaks. You've got a lot of social interactions. There's bright lights. Or if they're unclear instructions or questions or expectations and that sort of thing, can be very stressful and not friendly to someone who is struggling with lots of different things, like in addition to the normal procedure of being hired somewhere interviewing. And for admission, and just like being accepted into various things, a lot of times people are neurodivergent, just like those who identify more broadly as disabled. There are like GPA requirements. There are like special things like, oh, look at this person, they did X, Y, and Z. Well, someone who's got a lot of other things going on in their life might not be able to do all the X, Y's, and Z's. So sometimes I guess I'm saying like the most full resumes might be prioritized over someone who's just worked really hard to get there. It happened. Something to think about. Inflexible schedules, locations, and timelines. So if the more that we can be flexible with when things happen and where things happen and the timeline for it, the better, because sometimes people just are not in the right space to do the work, the assignment, etc. They need breaks. They are in an environment they can't work in. They need to find a better one. They get overstimulated and need some time to decompress, something like that. For many people are neurodivergent, and although I don't identify as autistic, I've been told that this is a very big problem for them, but it is for me as well, as someone with ADHD. Unclear, unstated expectations are very difficult. When it's just sort of hinted at or subtly messaged, or someone thinks that everyone understands it, but it's not like super clear, that is very stressful. It's exhausting to try to figure it out. Like what is expected, what are people doing, thinking you're going to do, etc. And then the last thing I have on here is any sort of permission for discrimination or ableist language. So that could be tolerating jokes, that could be tolerating, you know, not preferred language. This is across the board for all identities, but I just want to mention it here too. And I'll call us out, you know, the members of our communities that are the professors, supervisors, leaders. You're not in control of people's behavior, but you are responsible for creating the environment, in my view. That's just my opinion. Okay, communication struggles. So neurodivergent people often have a variety of communication issues. And I'd already talked about the unclear one, and here it is again. So if you are unclear or implying something, it's quite likely to be missed or misunderstood. And so the more you can avoid being vague and be very direct and be very clear and thorough and organized in your thoughts, the easier for everyone, not just people who identify as neurodivergent, but to think about that as a supervisor, as a professor, as a provost, as a dean, as whoever, to think about being as clear as possible. Because people are going to miss those subtle cues. They might not be able to interpret your facial expression or see them, honestly. They might not be able to tell you're joking. Even if most people do, someone might not. So those are just things to keep in mind, especially when you are in charge of someone's either grade or their assessment, etc. That's difficult stuff. Just be very clear. I say unclear, unstated expectations. Just don't hint. Okay. A little bit about masking. Probably everyone here is a little bit familiar or can guess what this is, but masking is trying to avoid identification of a part of your identity that you do not want others to be aware of for whatever reason. In terms of neurodivergence, I found this, this was a blog post that this person, neurodivergent Lou, left. I found in my quest to learn more last year. I just really liked it, so I'm going to read it. So to me, autistic masking was concealing my autistic self to the point where I wasn't even sure who I was anymore. It was mimicking neurotypical people to mask the emptiness I felt in an attempt to feel a sense of belonging. So what I like about this quote is it kind of brings up the why, to feel like you belong, to feel like you're just part of the group, to feel like you're normal. Oh, a scary word to use, but you know, to not have a thing that makes you different. And it also talks a little bit about that concealing. So the mimicking, so masking is exhausting, and that I read about time after time after time. So in all kinds of different neurodivergent identities. So anyone who's trying to not be who they are and hide themselves in some way from others, you're constantly watching, scanning. It's a lot of being very, what's the word I'm looking for? Vigilant about your own behavior, vigilant about what others are doing and meeting expectations and emulating behavior. So it adds an enormous burden, and it contributes tremendously to burnout for people who are doing it. And they're not necessarily doing it from some sort of, dislike of themselves or cowardice or something. Like, it's to avoid that bias and discrimination and to be treated fairly. So there's a lot of reasons in our institutions to try to not be identified. So there are some things that make workplaces unfriendly for neurodivergent people. And these could change. These are just some. Everything in this talk today is like, there's variety. But some of the things I read about and have experienced personally is fluorescent lights, or too bright, too loud, buzzing, flickering. Lights are terrible and very distracting, can create an environment where someone just can't work. When there's noise, music, people talking loudly or laughing, that can be a really big issue too. It's very distracting. Strong odors. This is a big one for me and for a lot of people. So if you are a perfume person, if you've got smelly food or burnt popcorn or cleaning agents like Pine Sol or something, oh my gosh, it will like push me out of a whole space. And that one's pretty bad in the high school scene, as you can imagine, with my teenagers. Not mine, but the Axe spray. Oof. So being too hot or too cold, so temperature. A lot of people really appreciate, neurodivergent or not, but a private space where you can be alone, concentrate, not have to do that vigilance part of like, how am I being observed? Maybe you want to talk to yourself. Maybe you want to tap your leg. Maybe you just need to not worry about other people or see them and have that stimuli. Relatedly is the clutter disorder, dirty dishes, stuff all around from other people or your own that you don't want to have to clean up. So there's issues about that. And a last point I wanted to make is that although there's a lot written, and a lot of the things I read about and experienced personally is like too much stimulation is bad, there are a lot of people too who are sensory seeking. So some of us are sensory avoidant, trying to avoid those bright lights and noises, etc. But some people really seek that stimulation, and it calms them and helps them. And so they might not be aware of how they're impacting other people, or they might be afraid to be themselves or be comfortable or do the things they need to do to focus. So that's another side of that issue. So accommodations. Probably everyone here has heard about them, knows a little bit about them, but they are legally mandated. They're individualized modifications for work or education environments that people can get when they have specific, documented, and qualifying disabilities, right? Here we come back to that medicalization of disability, which allows them to get some things that can help them, do their work or get access to education. There are, though, and I think people have mentioned that this week, that there are people who could really benefit from accommodations in the neurodivergent world, in the disabled world, and beyond, who don't receive them. And some of the reasons for that, at least for those who may identify as either disabled or neurodivergent, is they don't want to declare their disability. They don't want to identify that way. They don't want to deal with the bias. They can't afford to get the documentation required, or they don't know how. It's inaccessible in some way. And they also don't know what kind of help could be available. I'll leave it at that. There's so much to say here, but it can be really overwhelming to get accommodations and time consuming and threatening, not necessarily here at CU or just here at CU, like across the board. It is written about extensively. It is very exhausting and it's vulnerable. You're putting it out there that you have these things you need help with. And if someone is going to be biased or discriminatory, it is hard, especially if you're having to tell a supervisor or a professor about it. And if they're not welcoming or open about it, or they think you don't really need it and they express that, etc. So that it can look a lot of different ways. Again, ableism is real and it can have really bad and negative impacts on people. So some of the impacts on people who identify as neurodivergent from this burnout. So I guess the thing that seems across the board is that if there's a reaction, it's going to be a lot harder, heavier, more intense, and longer lived for someone who identifies as neurodivergent. And a lot of the reason for that is just the burden of dealing with neurodivergence in a world designed for those who are not neurodivergent. So you've got all of that weight along with all of your work that you have to do. So there's just so much all the time. So that really leads to psychological stress and exhaustion. So those norms I say in here are really demanding. There's a lot of rigidity. There's trying to accommodate, because the person who's got these differences has to accommodate the real system, right? Real system, the system that's in place that is not designed for them. They have to deal with it. And so there's anxiety that goes along with that, and just a huge deficit to your personal energy. People will also see, because of this and trying to deal with all these different factors, often they face in the working world a decreased professional advancement. So because the system is not generally set up for the neurodivergent, they have a hard time, like, showing they're above and beyond, even if they are, because they have so many factors they're dealing with. And sometimes they can only just get by. And in the student world, there's a lot of evidence that disabled and neurodivergent students do not get nearly the kinds of like stipends on top of things, grants, extra money to help them. The word for it is not coming. My working memory is shutting down on that word. But anyway, they get less money in funding. And it's very common, no matter how brilliant. And all of this stuff also leads to pretty significant social isolation. Not only from the communication challenges and maybe your brain works differently, but also just you don't have time. You don't have as much time to meet and chat and talk to people if you're trying to deal with rigid schedules and just making it work for you. So that social isolation has a lot of different causes that impact people. And no one does great with isolation. Even if you need time alone, being isolated is not good for anybody's mental health. Here are a few more of these impacts. So you're managing a lot. I've already made that kind of clear, I think. And the more stress you have as a neurodivergent person, a lot of times, and I think anyone who identifies as neurodivergent here could probably speak to this, your traits, your different thinking, your perhaps different needs in the workplace or as a student get more extreme the more stressed you are, right? So the more and more stressed I am, the less tolerant I am of the music or the loud noises or the buzzing lights, or, or it affects me more. You can't mask as well. You can't cope as well. Some would argue very strongly that masking is not the way, but I'm sure not going to tell anybody what they're supposed to do. We all have to find our way through, So this all leads to more intense burnout. They're much more deeply impacted. I read many accounts, actually, of people, especially autistic people, just getting to the point of burnout so extreme they couldn't just take a leave of absence. They had to completely become unemployed for a while and recover. But that leads to financial trouble. And, it's like a big, terrible cycle. And once again, that social isolation part of burnout and just not being able to deal with people and bring them into your life. And also there's a lot of stigma that comes around with being significantly burned out. Because if you're neurodivergent and burned out, you're not just complaining about, oh, I feel so burned out. You're like not functional in a lot of cases, at least from my perspective. So what can we do? I have no idea what time it is. So I might be going a little too long here, but I will try to be quick.
It's 10:56, just so you know.
Oh, dang. Yeah. It is really late, so I'll be very quick. And And I can talk a little after the hour if anyone wants to stay. But I see this, and many people see this, as a systemic problem. Our group in the library found this. And a lot of the solutions we're given for burnout are often individual things, like take a bubble bath. That's my favorite bad example. So that's my statement there. So a first step is to evaluate our academic and work environments for all of the ableist policies and physical space issues and evaluation procedures and hiring practices. And all of this takes input from our disabled and neurodivergent communities, as well as all the other identities that need to put some input there. Number two is supportive supervisors are kind of like the most important thing in the literature about helping people. So making sure our supervisors are educated, informed, our mentors also in the educational side play the same role, and advisors. Those people are so important, and there are a lot of trainings available, and has been hosting them. You could do it. The next one, awareness of ableism and harmful language is absolutely essential. And this takes education, personnel trainings, ongoing discussions, reading books, having an open conversation about what is harmful and what is okay. And so those are really hard conversations to have a lot of times. But I think we have to have a lot more of them so people are aware, and just to keep learning and asking and reading and not putting people on the spot or tokenizing them, but looking at the blogs and the books, etc. I have a lot of resources, and I know a lot of other people do too. And I'd say probably the most important thing is that we need invested and supportive leadership. Without our leaders who are willing to talk about these issues and listen to people and take perspectives from the neurodivergent community, as well as disabled community, as our other racial communities and gender communities and everybody, if that leadership is not listening and is not paying attention and isn't caring, there's really no way to develop solutions. And I say here that supervisors and mentors are that first line of support, but they are just not going to be as effective if they are not backed up by our leadership. And that can look a lot of different ways. I know this is all very vague, but, and I believe that is all that I had today. Sorry, I was very vague about a lot of things. And I already see a hand up. Jeffrey, did you have a question? So I'm going to just be done there. We can talk about 15 hours on this stuff, but I invite questions and comments and anyone who would like to share anything.
Sorry about that. When I raised my hand earlier, just to answer your question about do I experience burnout, that was that. And
Don't worry.
never took it down. Never thought to take it down. Sorry about that.
Oh, for sure.
But
Oh, yeah.
but terrific presentation. Lots of
Oh,
great stuff there.
great. Thank you. I will be today, just everyone, that we're having an event in the libraries. We're having a watch party for Hayden Crystal, who is our keynote, an activist and comedian. So I have a watch party in the libraries in the CBIS, our fancy room on the 5th floor, from 12:30 to 3. So we could have lots of conversations there. So please feel free to join me for that, and many of my colleagues. I'm hoping to get a lot of librarians to come. I know this is a lot of stuff, but I'm happy to meet with anyone who'd like to chat. I'd love feedback. You can tell me I got it all wrong, because, you know, I sure could get lots of things wrong. Anyway, thank you all for coming.